Hello and welcome to another Patreon exclusive. Today we are going to be painting a Magnolia in watercolor, and it is a recent exercise that we did in my beginner courses, so it is a simplified version of a Magnolia for those who are new to watercolor especially. To begin, we are just going to transfer our outline sketch onto a piece of watercolor paper. I've made a mixture of quinacridone rose and crimson red lake, and I've just mixed up 4 consistencies of that color, so a light, a little bit darker, mid-tone, and a dark. To begin, in my first petal on the left, I'm just painting in clean water to create a wet surface, and I will start painting in with my lightest color for a wet on wet technique. I'm going to start by adding in the lightest color, and I'm quite tight on my water control, so I pick up very little so that I don't overly saturate that area with water, and then I go and pick up a little bit of the darker value. Because I'm working into a wet surface, being the wet on wet technique, that color isn't at its full saturation, so it does diffuse a little bit in the wet water, but we work in layers and in increments of saturation. So I've picked up a little bit more of the dark now, and as I go in, you'll see the darker saturation coming through a lot stronger. I'm now going to pick up the darkest value of my mixture, so almost from the buttery consistency, and I'm bringing that color in at its full concentration just to come and create a dramatic increase in contrast. Still working wet on wet, although some things do start drying, so we want to work quickly but not rushed. And then I do rinse off my brush, wipe it off, and drag it along where we've just added that paint in, so it's not as hard a line as if it was wet on dry, where it would dry almost as you paint it in, the line would be nice and sharp and straight. So I've just lifted off a little bit of that edge, or dragged along that edge, to give it a nice soft blend. On the right hand side, I'm just creating a light wash into this petal, and this is more to set an undertone. So once that has dried, I will bring in the darker color and leave the hint of a highlight on the edge of that petal. And into this base now, I'm not wetting it beforehand, just using a wet on dry technique, so a flat wash. And now while this is wet, I'm lifting off a little bit of that pigment from the top where it's lighter, and I'm picking up a little bit of the darker concentration to add into the bottom of that petal while it's wet. And this is probably the easiest section to paint in the whole painting. It's just that little slither of dark value in the middle of the magnolia. I'm adding that in because it's an easy thing to just get done. Because we're painting in these different sections, I can't paint two leaves that are next to each other. So this is the reason why I'm working in this almost haphazard fashion where I'm going from one petal to one that's further away from that. I never want to work with two petals next to each other in this kind of example. Otherwise it could lead to you bleeding colors into another petal next door. So I wait for petals to dry before I go back and paint anything alongside it. And that is the reason why I'm hopping around this flower. In this petal again, I'm using a wet on wet technique. So I've painted water in first, and I'm just bringing in my light and mid-tone values here to add that color into the petal. Now that this light petal is completely dry, I'm bringing in that much darker color, but I'm not painting all the way to the edge. I'm leaving a bit of a highlight, and it's a nice clean sharp line. So really just painting in a nice flat wash of the dark color and gonna leave it at that. Because I didn't paint to the edge of that smaller petal, I'm now coming in for my wet on wet technique on the petal in the foreground, or the main big one. So I'm just holding it upright so that I can see with the light that I've got full coverage of my water layer over that, and also not too much. So I don't want to have a puddle and a pool. I just want to have enough water that will help diffuse the paint as it settles in that wet on wet technique. To begin, I'm just going to lay in my lightest color to start mapping out sort of where my values are going to go into this wet surface. I'll start picking up a bit of the medium tone now, and this is just to give me that more contrasted background for that darker vein as well. And I'm just going to continue building this out in that wet surface. I'm not painting to the edges of that petal. I do want my paint to create a soft journey towards the edges of that petal. So it is obviously with that water layer in place first, it's going to help just travel it there, slightly more diffused, not as concentrated as the rest of the petal. To break the contrast a little bit, I'm using a dragging technique through the darker values here. So I rinse off and I wipe off my brush on a paper towel, and then I just drag it through to lift some of that heavy pigment off and just create a softer sort of feeling. I am going to come back in and add some pigment, but it's just to make it not as heavy at that like interchange between the petal towards the top and then obviously what's on the bottom. So I'm working in that darker pigment again. And with some clean water, I'm just going to come and paint in the lighter petal at the top, just because things will have started to dry and I want to have a bit of a wet on wet technique. So I'm adding water at the top again. I'm going to drag through my darks, and then I'm just going to plot in the darker values in the top of that petal. So there's consistency in that flow from the top to the bottom with its gradient. I'm starting to work towards the final touches on the petals, and we're sort of halfway there on the flower. Basically now I'm bringing in some darker contrast, and I'm just coming to plot in some of those values or shadows that I need to differentiate the petals from one another. With very light pressure and using the tip of my brush, I'm going to start bringing in the veins of the petals. So I'm just following the reference quite closely, just in terms of like the journey of the vein and the sort of flow of the vein through that petal. So it helps guide me on the placement. It doesn't necessarily have to be identical, but it will help make it feel more natural when you kind of follow the same journey as it was in the reference. While I'm busy with the veins on this one, I'm actually going to take this opportunity to touch up the base of that petal. So I'm going to bring in some of the darker pigment again, just to re-establish those dark values. And then using the lifting technique, I will just drag through to smooth out on the edges. For the stalk of my magnolia, or the branch of the magnolia, I'm giving it a base of the quinacridone roan and the crimson red lake mixture, so just using the lightest version of that color, and I'm really just establishing an undertone. For this little slither of green under the petals, I'm using a serpentine genuine, which is a Daniel Smith color. You could use anything in the realm of sap green, just a light green, and it's really just a light wash of that color anyway. And we build up our contrast with the next dark color that we're going to be using. For the main branch color, I've made a mixture of a bit of this quinacridone rose and crimson red lake, mixed with a little bit of a hematite genuine, which is going to give it that darker and granulating effect. And then I've added a bit of the burnt sienna just to give it some of that like browny warmth that we need. So I'm going to paint that into my branch. I came in with a bit too much pigment over there, so I've rinsed off my brush and just picked up some water to sort of spread that pigment around. And I'm basically gonna paint the whole branch through with this color. Some sections I will leave a little bit darker, and then I will let everything dry and come back in with my stronger contrasts for those final details. So where there are textures in the branch itself, I'm going to come and paint in those fine lines or dots, whatever blemishes I want to capture in the branch. And that is basically the magnolia painting done. without going into even greater detail, this exercise was intended for a beginner-friendly watercolorist. So it's really just a nice recap of technique in terms of wet on wet and wet on dry, and letting things dry to use the wet on dry technique, and then obviously putting into practice that working into a wet surface. Thank you so much for watching and for supporting me over here on Patreon. I really do appreciate it. And I hope that you enjoyed a beginner-friendly Magnolia in watercolor for the month of February, March. Within the month of March, I will be sharing another tutorial, a slightly more complex one for the more experienced or intermediate watercolor artists.